All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jose Andres, and today I am going to talk about a recurring problem that I've certainly faced quite some time, and that is when deploying logic apps. Okay, and I'll show you specifically what I mean. But before that, I want to give you some context. Okay, right now, I'm showing the official Bicep documentation on the Microsoft Learn site. And just to illustrate how Microsoft has invested, a lot of time and preparation into giving a reference overview of how to use Bicep, right? And of course, Bicep is very, very easy to use, and it's very beneficial because it allows you to deploy Azure resources using a declarative syntax, right? And if you check out the site even further, you'll see that there are a bunch of templates that are already set up, proposed, right, by Microsoft. So right now, for example, I'm showing one for deploying key vaults, right? And if you go through the documentation, you'll see specifically what you need in your template in order to deploy a successful resource, right? And this is, again, really, really good because it's easy. You have the documentation already there. You know how to set each one of the properties. And it's very easy to go about that, right? In that sense. However, for logic apps, specifically API connections, it's a different story. I'm going to show you a demo, not a demo. I mean an example of a logic app workflow, right? Where you can see, for example, here that I'm leveraging a service bus trigger, right? And that is using, of course, a connection. And then, my logic app performs some logic, some process. And in this case, it's only using the service bus API connection, right, on the triggers. However, it's a little difficult, right, when you want to deploy something like this through code, right? Imagine that you had an Azure pipeline, and you had a series of logic apps that made up, an integration, for example. Deploying it through code can be kind of cumbersome, because if you check the documentation, right, the template, the proposed template from Microsoft to deploy API connections, and just for the sake of the example, I mean API connections used in logic app consumption workflows, right? For standard, it's a little bit different in that sense. You'll see that, of course, you have the properties there to define your API connection, the name, the location, tags, that kind of thing. But then it doesn't really explain, how to authenticate to other Azure resources. And what I mean by that is, let's say, and I'm going to go to another logic app that I had prepared here, that I wanted to build a workflow that authenticated to SQL Server, right? There we go. So I'm going to choose, just to get the tables. To use this connector, to use this action specifically, in the wizard, you have, in the designer, you have you have a very friendly way to define, to set up that API connection, right? So you could define a name, choose the authentication type, and you'll see that you have some types already defined in there, so you can just click the one that best suits your need. And you have the parameters to authenticate, right? The parameters that you're going to need to ultimately authenticate to that resource. In this case, you see that you have the SQL Server name, you need the database name, the username, the password, and in case you were using an on-premises data gateway, you could select it from your subscription, choose it, and it'll create the connection for you, right? So when you use the designer, it's very, very easy in that sense. But what if you had to define this in Bicep, right? Well, if we go back to the proposed template, right, you don't really see what parameters or what are the key names that you need to use. So that's a problem, right? And that's what I'd like to discuss today. So if we go further, you'll see that to define these properties, it's not as straightforward. So what some if you look for those properties, or you try to look online, you'll find many blogs, many repos about how you deploy specific API connections to specific resources, right? And even Microsoft proposes some quick templates on how to use or how to connect to these resources, right? So, for example, you were to click on this very first one, it'll take you to a repository, and then you could, in your digging, in your research, you could try to dig around how you would define that connection according to this example, and you would find it, right? So, for example, here, it's deploying a service bus connection, very similar to the one being used in the example that I showed in the trigger, and you will see that for this particular connection, you'd need the connection string, right, of the service bus namespace, and that's all you would need. And then you would play around with deploying the connection or with deploying the Bicep template locally, or maybe you already have it set up in your pipeline, and then you would play around with, okay, I have to use this connection string, or I have to use this key, this property name, under parameter values, right, to try to get it to deploy automatically, right? But that's very, very troublesome, because for some resources, right, Service Bus, Key Vault, Azure SQL database, you'll have a lot of examples, right? And it's very, I'd say that's the easiest way to find the parameters or the key names that you need to deploy the API connections. But what if you're using a connector or a connection that's not so famous, right? One that's not used very frequently by that community in that sense. Okay, there's a way to try to discover what are those parameter names, or under which property, according to the Bicep template, should these authentication properties go under, right? So let's continue with this example. I'm going to delete this action, and I'm going to choose maybe this one. It's probably not used quite a lot. This HTTP with Entra ID, right? I'm going to create a new connection, and just for the sake of the example, I'm going to choose connect via on-premises data gateway, and then we have the property names, right? So again, in the designer, it's very easy to see because you would just set up the connection. I'm going to try to do that very fast. Base URL, app, ID, URI, some username, password, and then I'm just going to leave it as that. Okay. Of course, this is of course going to fail because I'm not setting the some valid values for creating the connection. But what I do want to show you is that you can use the developer tools of the browser, right, to inspect what's going on behind the scenes when you're creating these connections. So before I create the actual API connection, I'm going to go to the network tab, right, and I'm going to make sure that it is recording the network activity, and I'm going to create it. Okay, and that will pick up what was sent, and then you can search for what was the payload that was sent. And if you take a closer look, you'll see that it'll give you greater insight into what are the names, what are the names of the keys, right, for the parameters, and also where they go under. So, for example, you'll see here that for this connection in particular, the parameter values, the parameters go under parameter values, right, instead of maybe non-secret parameter values or custom parameter values, right? It doesn't really explain, it doesn't really tell you under which property should these parameters go, right? If you take a look at the documentation, okay, So let's go back. Now you can leverage this this tool when deploying the API connections, the templates in your pipelines, right? Because you'll know exactly where the parameters go and how they are named. Okay, so I guess the presentation for today is, you could say it's probably a rant, right? It'd be beneficial, I believe, for the community if you had you know, a list of how to authenticate to specific resources under specific connectors that are being used in Logic apps, right? And per authentication type, right? You already have a connectors reference overview that explains all the connectors that are available in Logic apps in Azure and also in Power Platform, specifically for Power Automate. But it doesn't explain into detail how you would set that up in Bicep or ARM or Terraform, whatever tool you use. So for example, if you go to the SQL Server connector reference page, right, you'll see that under creating a connection, you have the authentication types that we saw in the demo, and you can choose one of them and see that these are the same parameters that we saw in the designer, right? And the same thing applies in the case of HTTP with Microsoft Entra ID, which was the other connector, right? You can see that it holds, or it supports, the default connection, and that default connection has these same parameters, which are the ones that we set in the example as well, and the ones that we can see here under the network panel, right, using the developer tools. So this is something to take into account, right, and probably something that could save time when developing, right? So I guess the call to action would be to have some sort of addition, right, to the connector reference overview page per connector. Maybe that's possible, I don't know, but it'd be nice to have, right? But fun to think about, to have a site where you could go and check how exactly do you define the authentication parameters for specific connectors to specific resources in Azure. All right, straight up simple. All right, guys. Well, I hope this does save you time as much as it did save me when I found out how to take advantage of this tool. And if you have any doubts or any questions, you can put them up in the chat and I can address them later. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. The next speaker is actually still missing. So if you want, you can talk a bit longer. So, or we can also have a short chat just for fun until the next speaker is showing up.
Yeah, I mean, when I found out about this, oh man, it saved me weeks on development time, to be completely straight with you. Just because, it doesn't give you, I mean, you can search all you want in the online for blogs, and you can watch YouTube tutorials and all that, but it just takes one opportunity when you have to use a connector where there's no documentation about it, right? And then you have to dive into struggling and trying to see what's out there.
Yeah, I can imagine, and I know how it is like. I've experienced it with other similar stuff myself. Of course, it's until then you realize it's actually easier than you thought it would be. Something like this. It's oftentimes, or sometimes actually less often. It's harder than you think it would be. Right? It's
Indeed.
Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to reach out for the next speaker. It's Ignacio Baró. I did actually already try. So, but I don't know what happened. I hope he's doing well. So let's see. If you offer it, you can still show a bit more if you want, or you can choose to go. It's up to you, Jose.
Oh man, I think I showed everything as straight to the point as I
Okay.
could. So I'll be logging off. Thank you for having
Sure.
me, guys.
All
For
right.
sure.
Thank you. Thank you a lot. Have a
Bye
nice day.
bye.
Bye bye.